Hi everyone, welcome to our Valentine's Day virtual chocolate tasting. We will give everyone just a few minutes if they're still joining. It's a little bit before 5 o'clock. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Lauren. I'll be your host for tonight. We would love to know where you're all joining us from. If you want to use the chat box to write where you're joining us from, and if you've tried our chocolate before, or if you've done one of these tastings, or if this is your very first time doing one, we'd love to hear from you. So feel free to use that chat box throughout the entire tasting experience. That'll be the best way to talk to myself and Mark just on feedback of what you're tasting, what you're liking. And then there's also a Q&A function where if you have any questions about the pieces or the product or about Mark in general, go ahead and put those in the Q&A so we can separate them and better answer your questions that way. And I think we can just go ahead and get started. If you have not done one of these tastings before in person or virtually, we try to keep it as interactive as possible. So as I mentioned, use the chat box, use the Q&A so that we can kind of emulate that back and forth with the chocolatier that we usually have in person. Since we can't see or hear any of you, we would love to have you tag us on Facebook or Instagram at Ethel Chocolate so we can see how you have your Valentine's Day set up and who you're doing it with and just see who's joining us. Make sure you have your heart box, hopefully uneaten. There are a few extra pieces in there that we'll go over at the very end. So we're going to taste about 5 pieces, and then we'll talk about the remaining pieces at the very end. And I will go ahead and get into the history of Ethel. If you haven't heard of us before, we are a Mars company. So that top left photo is Forrest Mars. Him and his father Frank started the Mars Chocolate Company, which makes products like M&M's, Snickers, Skittles, Twix, all the candy I'm sure you all have tried and love. After Forrest retired, he moved to Henderson, Nevada, and got to thinking, you weren't really a true chocolatier until you had your own gourmet line of boxed chocolates. So that's exactly what he set out to do. He started making boxed chocolates using his mother Ethel's recipes. And in 1981, he opened the factory that you see in that top middle photo. So this is our flagship store and our factory where we make all of our products. He also started a botanical garden just outside, and it has now grown to 4 acres with over 300 species of cacti. You can see on the 2 photos to the right, that is our cactus garden in bloom, and it is absolutely gorgeous. It's really pretty from May to April to May. If you're in the Vegas area, come out and see us. And then we also decorate the garden with over 1 million LED lights, and you'll see that. And the bottom middle photo is our cactus during the wintertime, and that's from November to January. We decorate it and turn it into a really beautiful winter wonderland, and it's really fun. So if you missed it this year, definitely come out next year and check it out. The last thing I want to point out is our solar panel garden. The bottom left photo is just a small picture of it, but it is huge. It's 4 acres, and it's just behind our cactus garden. And that helps to power our factory during sunlight hours. We're super lucky to have a ton of sun here in Vegas and Henderson, so that has been amazing. So you can really feel good about the product that you're eating tonight. So I will go ahead and introduce your chocolatier for tonight. It is Mark Mackey. He is our product development manager and chief chocolatier for Ethel Chocolates. He actually holds US and international patents for his work on improvement to the texture and shelf life of chocolate. And he holds a degree from the Culinary Institute of America in New York and currently lives in Las Vegas. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Mark.
Hi, everybody. Very nice to be with all of you tonight. Happy Valentine's Day to everybody. We've got some of our delicious Valentine's Day chocolate here that we'll be tasting here tonight. But more importantly, we're going to be tasting, but also we're going to be really going on a chocolate journey and really evaluating each piece of chocolate. Obviously, taste is important, but we also want to use all of our other senses to really get a feel for what this chocolate is about. So using your sense of touch, we're going to want to actually pick up the chocolate, look at it. Is it bumpy? Is it smooth? We want to use our sense of smell and our nose as well. As many of you know, a lot of what you actually taste is experienced or helped by your olfactory senses up here in your nose. All of this is connected. So, if you're ever sick, and your sinuses are kind of stuffed up, you typically are not going to be able to taste very well. So tonight we want to make sure that we're smelling our chocolate. That's going to help to prepare our palate for the flavors that we'll be experiencing once we taste and bite into that piece. Taste, obviously, so textures. We want to think about how is the chocolate melting in our mouths. Believe it or not, depending on the specific chocolate and the ingredients, that's actually going to melt a little differently, maybe a little slower, maybe a little bit faster. So pay attention to that as we go through. When we bite into our chocolates tonight, typically I like to bite the piece in half and then save the second half for your beverage pairing if you have it. But the first half, kind of press that piece up against the roof of your mouth, and that's going to get everything kind of starting to melt down together. And if we do that the same way with every piece, we can kind of compare and contrast the melt of those specific pieces. Want to be thinking about textures, flavors. Is the flavor coming out up front, or is it a little bit reserved and coming in more toward the back end? And also finish, just like a glass of delicious wine has an aftertaste or a linger, our chocolate has the same. And in fact, there are some of the same compounds actually in chocolate as there are in red wine, some of those tannins. But finish or linger. So depending on the specific chocolate, it might have a short linger or short aftertaste, or it might have a long and lingering finish. So kind of pay attention to that as well. But most importantly, we really want to have fun tonight when we go through each piece. We want to kind of slow down and really think about what we're tasting and how those flavors are coming out in the different pieces that we'll be trying tonight. And I mentioned this just a minute ago, but beverage pairings are a great way to kind of augment the experience as well. Completely optional, but we have some recommendations I think that we sent out ahead of time for our chocolates. Typically, if somebody asks me, they want to pair really one wine with pretty much all chocolate, I would always normally recommend like a Pinot Noir or maybe a Chianti, something that's a little more medium bodied. So we have a couple of those choices, I think, on the screen as well, or in the literature that was sent out. Those are going to have really jammy, juicy, kind of fruit-forward notes that will really share the stage with the chocolate. It won't overpower it, which is something that we want to make sure that we don't do when we're trying to taste kind of everything in our mouths. And then also there is another one here. It's a little not quite as common, but it's called Rosa Regale Bracchetto d'Acqui, and it's a lightly sparkling red wine. It's kind of like a little bit of like a rosé with some sweetness to it, and it's only about 7% alcohol, so really easy to enjoy that one as well. But it's got a lot of really nice jammy and juicy fruity notes that pair well with pretty much all chocolate. All right, and if you don't have any wine tonight, that's perfectly fine. I've got some water here, but really important when we go through the chocolates, whether you're tasting with wine or not, to kind of cleanse your palate in between each piece. And that'll help to allow our taste buds to kind of reset before we go into the next piece. Now you'll see a little photo of the tasting mat. Hopefully you all have those in front of you as well. And you can, as we go through tonight, you can kind of capture some notes if you'd like on each of the pieces. Completely optional. Feel free to capture notes in each of those areas or not, or you can just try to jot down if you like the piece or if what you thought of it, the different textures, flavors. I like to kind of compare and contrast as I go through. And also refer to the tasting wheel in the lower left-hand side. And if you look at that, it's going to have all of the aromas and the flavors, those specific notes that we'll be tasting in actually all of our Ethel chocolate. We won't probably hit on all of those notes, but many of them we'll be able to pick up in the pieces tonight. And you'll notice some things that are probably very familiar to you: fruity, floral, spicy, roasted notes. But then you may also notice in the earthy category something that's a little bit different, and something that you may not expect your chocolate to taste like, or you may not want it to taste like that. And that's perfectly fine to think that. And in fact, I don't always want to have my chocolate tasting earthy, but it's important to note that this wheel is incorporating you know, the primary flavors like caramel or dairy, caramelized sugar, things like that, and also secondary or kind of background flavors. And the important thing about those is that they're really, you know, providing character to the chocolate. And although you may not taste it like pronounced, sometimes it kind of sneaks in there in the background and really elevates the piece and gives it a little more complexity and character. So be on the lookout for those as well. So let's get started with, I've already been talking here for a few minutes. I'm sure you all ready to enjoy some chocolate. So let's pick up our first piece, very themed appropriately for the day. This is our milk chocolate peanut butter hearts. And it's actually a Valentine's Day themed version of one of our most popular pieces, our peanut butter piece. And the first thing you'll notice about this is that really nice kind of vibrant red color. If you look, you can actually see it kind of glistens a little bit, like a really nice piece of jewelry. It's kind of got some pearlescent qualities to it. And what this is actually colored cocoa butter. So we take cocoa butter from the chocolate making process, and we'll actually color that, and we'll put that into an airbrush, and we'll actually spray all of the molds by hand. For this one, it was the heart mold, but that kind of gets airbrushed. And the chocolate, once it goes into that mold, will actually pick up that color, and it'll adhere to the surface of the piece once it's removed. So go ahead and pick this one up, and we want to get a nice feel for the aroma. So I always kind of flip. I normally don't rub like the cocoa butter side because you can get some of that off on your fingers, but flip it over and you'll have the bottom, which is where the milk chocolate side is. And just kind of rub it, kind of soften the chocolate a little bit. It will help to kind of activate some of those aroma compounds. Somebody's asking for the name. This is the milk chocolate peanut butter hearts. Sorry about that. And it's the red colored heart piece. So kind of bring that up to your nose. I can kind of cut my hand around. And I like to take a really nice deep breath and really think about all of those aromas. And you can get those peanut notes coming all the way through the chocolate. The peanut butter that we use for this piece, it's actually the center of the piece. It's just really 3 ingredients. It's fresh roasted peanuts, and then we add just a tiny bit, about 0.5% or so of salt and about 0.5% of sugar. And that really accentuates and elevates the flavor of the peanuts. But that's basically it. And that is all that forms the center of this piece. So go ahead and lift it up to your nose and take a nice breath of that in, kind of get a sense for the smell. Take a bite. You can see that wonderful peanut butter on the inside of the piece. So right away, you should be getting those roasted peanut flavors kind of coming out, very prominent. And then as you kind of work that around and press your tongue up against the roof of your mouth, then you're going to start to get that milk chocolate melting that's around the outside of the piece. And as that peanut butter kind of blends with that melted chocolate, it's going to introduce some creamy notes, some milk or like scalded milk or cooked milk, roasted cocoa. You're going to get those beautiful milk chocolate essences rather. Vanilla as well. What about you guys? What are you tasting? If you look at that wheel in front of you, I would love to see in the comments kind of what other flavors. Obviously peanut. I think I mentioned that in the beginning, but is anybody getting any like little bit of woodiness maybe in like the earthy category? A lot of times when we roast peanuts, because we're doing that at a high heat, you can generate, a lot of nuts actually do pick this up, but a little bit like a hint of some woodiness or even, yes, smoked notes, some smokiness kind of coming in from that roasted peanut. As we'll see when we touch on the next few pieces, whenever we heat or roast nuts, we're going to be generating brown flavors and sugar as well. But anytime we heat something and get it above like the point of boiling, we're going to be caramelizing or browning, and that's going to develop a lot of different flavors in the products. So with peanuts, a lot of those can be coming in through that roasting process. Very different than like a raw peanut or a blanched peanut. All right, now if you've got your wine, I have my glass of Pinot Noir here, but you might also have a glass of champagne, also a great choice. I always like to kind of swirl the wine a little bit, get some of the air movement happening there, especially if you just opened the bottle. And then do the same thing, you know, take a nice like deep breath, really get a feel for the aromas of the wine. Some of those berry notes, those fruity notes. Take a sip and then take another bite of your piece. And this time think about, okay, how are the flavors evolving? How are they changing in my mouth with that wine? Is the wine contrasting it, or is it comparing it or complementing it rather? And think about that, and you can capture some notes on that if you'd like to as well. And while you're enjoying that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where chocolate comes from.
And Mark, quick question. I wanted
Sure.
to interrupt. Someone had a question, what other sparkling beverages or non-alcoholic drinks go well with these pieces for tonight?
So I would say, you know, LaCroix, I believe, it doesn't have to be LaCroix. There are a number of, I guess, sparkling waters that you can get from Costco, Sam's Club, you know, any, you know, major grocer, I think. Anything that has maybe like a little bit of berryness to it, or even like a little bit of like a fruitiness, I think could work really well with chocolate. Specific for this one, the peanut butter piece, you know, when you try that with like a red wine, something that's jammy or juicier, or even like a flavored carbonated water, that jamminess or juiciness can actually kind of give you a little bit of like a peanut butter and jelly kind of experience, which is kind of cool. But I would start there. There are some mocktail recipes. I can't think of any right now, but I know that there are a few that we've talked about in the past, specific to chocolates. But I would say, you know, when in doubt, any of the flavored carbonated waters should work pretty nicely.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure, and then another one, coffee as well. I know it might be a little late for that, but you know, chocolate and coffee have a lot of similarities to them in the way that they're roasted, and they actually have some similar flavors as well. And so if you want to try even a little bit of coffee, you know, obviously you don't want it to be piping hot, but you know, something that can really match the intensity of the chocolate, that may be a nice experience for you as well also. But anyway, I'm going to take a sip of water here, and we'll talk a little bit about where chocolate comes from. So chocolate doesn't really grow everywhere. If it's growing, it really needs to be in a tropical environment, you know, and that's typically about 20 degrees north and south of the equator. Places like, you've got like Latin America there, part Brazil, Ecuador, Ghana, Dominican Republic, Philippines. These are all areas, the Cote d'Ivoire in Africa, Ivory Coast. These are all places where a lot of cocoa is grown. Cocoa really needs that humid kind of tropical environment in which to thrive. And you know, in fact, it really does its best when it's growing kind of in the canopy of the rainforest, underneath those very tall trees. It really wants to be shaded to allow for it to grow really well. And in fact, here I have an actual cocoa pod. So this is actually what is growing on the tree. And you'll see when these grow, they're going to grow not just on the branches of the tree, but actually on the trunk of the tree as well. And it's going to be kind of interesting because it is a fruit. And you know, when the farmers are growing this, they're going to have to actually cut this down by hand when the cocoa is ripe. And so what they'll do is, when these are growing, they're going to turn different colors, and depending on the specific variety of cocoa, that is actually going to potentially turn yellow, could turn orange, could turn green, could turn brown. You know, the farmer needs to know what specific variety of cocoa he's growing, whether it's Forastero, Criollo, or Trinitario. Those are the three main types of cocoa, but they're all going to be a little bit different in size, a little bit different in shape. So he needs to know when his crop is ready and ripened, so that he can harvest it. He or she can harvest it. And they're going to slice those pods off using something very advanced, typically a machete or just a long knife. And what they're looking for is this what's in the center. You know, we don't want this thick outer hull. We actually want to cut into this pod and get the beans that are inside. So I'm going to do that right now. I don't have a machete, but I've got just a chef's knife here. Show you kind of what the inside of this looks like. Don't be scared, but it looks nothing. It looks kind of gross. It's nothing like chocolate. These are actually cocoa beans, kind of like something out of that movie Alien. But these are actual fresh cocoa beans in there. As I mentioned, see that thick hull on the outside? We don't want that. Farmers will actually they'll scoop these beans out across, you know, many pods, and they're going to pile those beans up on the floor of the jungle, typically on like some banana leaves or maybe on a table. You know, but we're going to scoop all these beans out, and then these husks or hulls get kind of thrown aside. They'll decompose and, you know, go back into the soil and contribute some nutrients back into that soil. But this is really what we want. I'm going to grab a bean here to show you. But they're kind of gross look. Like they're just like really weird. Like they're the bean that we want is underneath this white pulp. And I promise you at this stage, nothing smells like chocolate. Nothing tastes like chocolate. In fact, if I kind of taste this, it has just a very delicate flavor. It's kind of it's actually similar to like a lychee. If you ever had like a fresh lychee, or even like it's not really like pineapple. It's more like a lychee, but it's got a little bit more acidity to it. But it's very delicate and kind of has this nice tropical flavor and aroma to it. But that pulp itself, while it doesn't taste like chocolate, it actually helps us to develop our chocolate, and it helps us to ferment the beans. So this pulp has sugar in it, and when sugar is allowed to kind of sit out in the, you know, that's going to start to break down, and those sugars are going to start to break down into acetic and lactic acid, and it's going to start this fermentation process. The natural flora and fauna and the yeasts in the air are actually going to mix with those beans, and fermentation will start. So the fermentation is actually going to take about 5 to 7 days. And over that period of time, it's going to be developing all of these nuances and these flavors in those finished cocoa beans. Without fermentation, our cocoa is not going to be as, that's not going to have all those fruity and floral nuances that we're looking for. And you'll see the beans will go from this white color to brown as that moisture kind of subsides, and we get more fermentation happening. And now, once the fermentation is complete, the farmer's going to check over the beans, and then he's going to dry them out. And he'll do that by putting them onto a thin layer on a table. Hold on, somebody's mentioning that they might be having problems with the video. Hopefully we fixed, I guess, Lauren, check and see if anybody's having issues with the video. Otherwise I'll keep going. But the farmer is going to place those beans onto a table, just a very thin layer, to get the air to circulate so that we dry those beans out. We don't want any moisture to remain on them. We don't want any mold to grow. We don't want any critters to kind of make off with our beans. So we want to get those dried out very, very quickly. And now I think we'll jump back. Hopefully you guys had a chance to finish that first piece. And we'll jump back to our audio stays. So keep going, please. Okay.
And Mark, I'm going to interrupt you one more time. You mentioned the critters going off with the fruit. Are there any animals that eat the pods off the tree or just the beans?
There are, I mean, you know, insects, I mean, you've got lots of little animals, you know, that will make off with the beans. So, you know, these beans themselves, kind of something interesting. The pulp on the outside of the bean, that white pulp, is very sweet, which is great for fermentation, as we mentioned. But, you know, also a lot of those critters love that flavor. And so what happens is when they bite, you know, they grab some of the beans, they'll scurry away and they'll be, you know, eating that sweet pulp. And then as soon as they get past the pulp and into the center of the bean, which is actually what we used to make chocolate, that's very bitter. And so then typically those animals or those critters will spit the bean out. And that is how a lot of how the cocoa actually is kind of propagates, because those beans are being spread out over a bit of a larger area. Those beans will then turn into new cocoa plants or cocoa trees. And so that bitterness and that sweetness is really important to the actual propagation of the cocoa plant.
Amazing. Thank you.
So sun drying. So let's jump back to our next piece of chocolate here. This is our milk chocolate sea salt caramel. First thing you'll notice about this piece is that square, obviously, it's going to be nice light brown color. And then you'll notice that sprinkle of sea salt on top. And that's not just any sea salt. We actually use a French gray sea salt. And it comes to us from Brittany, France. And the reason why it's called gray salt, it actually is crystallized in the bay just outside of Brittany, France. And in that bay, you have a lot of clay. And that salt picks up a little bit of the clay and kind of breaks up the flavor of the salt. So it adds a little bit of minerality, a little touch of earthiness that otherwise, you know, just works really, really nicely with chocolate. It enhances the flavors of chocolate and the caramel piece. And we'll be tasting that in a second. But go ahead and flip it over, get a feel for the aroma of the piece. Get some butter coming through, of course, milk chocolate. And now, when you go to take a bite, I'd like to challenge you to do something a little different. So with the first half, if you will bite it upside down, so actually put the salt on your tongue, bite it in half, and then kind of rub it around your tongue and let that salt start to dissolve a little bit before you kind of bite further into the piece. And that's going to enhance and accentuate a lot of the flavors in the chocolate and in the caramel. And then the second half, you can flip it over and try it the other way if you'd like, or also do it the same way as you did with the first half. But kind of just place it in your tongue, take a bite, and then let it sit upside down. Kind of get some of that salt start dissolving. You're gonna get that salinity, saltiness, but then the milk chocolate will start to melt and you're gonna get some roasted cocoa, some cooked milk, vanilla. And then the milk chocolate starts to subside a little bit. And then that buttery vanilla caramel is going to start to melt. It starts to get a little firmer too. And as it warms up in your mouth, it'll get a little more elastic. But now you've got caramelized sugar, butter, cream, vanilla, all of these wonderful flavors that are now kind of coming. Exactly, yeah, the sea salt does, because it's enhancing a lot of those flavors, you kind of can still taste it in the background a little bit as well. Now, if you'd like, you can try the other half, you know, with your wine, or you can also flip it right side up or keep it upside down if you'd like. But if you try that again with another piece, I think you'll find those two experiences are very different. Having the salt dissolve first, or the salt dissolve later. But with this piece, we actually start, to make this piece, we start with sugar, butter, and cream. And we're gonna heat, I call those the trinity of ingredients in chocolate making, but all the delicious ingredients, we're gonna heat those up. until they're between 230 and 240 degrees. So at that stage, we're actually caramelizing sugar. And we're going to be developing this beautiful golden brown color, as you can see in the photo there. Those ingredients are being heated up. We're going to be stirring them, developing that wonderful flavor that's going to be coming out through the caramelization process, but also something that's a little bit different. It's called the Maillard reaction. So caramelization is typically, it involves really browning, caramelizing of sugar or carbohydrates, whereas the Maillard reaction is similar, but it has to do with proteins or amino acids. And so when you grill a steak, that's going to be like the Maillard reaction. And so with this one, we're going to be creating these wonderful caramelized notes through two different processes or chemical reactions, caramelization and the Maillard reaction, which is happening with the cream and the protein and the butter and the cream. But as we develop that, we get all that wonderful flavor. Now we want to cool it down, and we're going to do that very, very quickly with our temperature controlled tables. And so just before the caramel is poured onto these cold tables, we're going to add in a little bit of natural vanilla. And the reason for that is the natural vanilla that we use has over 300 different, natural vanilla actually has over 300, I believe, compounds that make up like the vanilla flavor, that complex natural vanilla flavor. And a lot of those flavors are driven off by high heat. Really anything above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, you will kind of cook off those flavors. And so we want to keep as many of those as in our chocolate or in our caramel as possible. So we're going to add that in at the last possible moment. Then we'll cool it down on our temperature controlled tables. That's going to cool the caramel down rapidly. And we will cut that long slab into squares by hand, which we will then place onto our enrobing line, and they'll get covered in our Ethel milk chocolate. And that French gray sea salt will get sprinkled by hand on top of each piece to finish. Anybody have any questions with this one specifically? All right, go back and try your second half of the piece there. Capture any notes that you'd like. And now we will jump to our next piece, which is kind of similar to the caramel. It starts off the same way, but it is a little bit different. I'll explain that in a second. So pick up this piece. This is our almond butter crisp. So you'll see it's colored with this bright copper colored foil here. So this does two things for us. It actually is protecting the piece. So you'll notice when you unwrap it, you'll see these chopped nuts on the out. Whoops, almost dropped it. These chopped nuts on the outside. So these are chopped almonds, and these are raw almonds on the outside. So raw almonds, especially chopped almonds, chopped anything really, they're susceptible to oxidation, or basically if they're exposed to the air, they'll start to go off, after a period of time. They'll start to go stale. And so we want to protect those almonds from the air. So we're going to wrap it up in that foil. And the second thing is the copper color is kind of a nod to the copper kettles that we use to actually make the piece. But this is a butter toffee. So toffee is similar to a caramel actually. So the piece that we made previously, we're going to make something very similar to that, but instead of heating those ingredients to 230 degrees or between 230 and 240, we're actually going to keep heating all of that up. So once we get to that temperature, we're going to drive up the temperature up to 300 degrees. And what that's going to do is take the caramel from that caramel kind of chewy texture into a toffee. It's going to be a much firmer texture when we bite into it. And you'll be able to notice that by the audible snap that you hear when you bite into the piece. But for this one has almonds in it, and it has this toffee. We actually add almonds in during that cooking process. So those almonds get kind of butter roasted in all that delicious toffee. And then once we cool the toffee down, we'll actually cut it into squares and add just a little bit of chocolate and roll it in a second almond. These are the raw almonds that I spoke to a second ago. So there's actually two different types of almonds in this piece. There's the butter roasted almonds inside of the toffee, and then the raw almonds on the outside. So they both give different flavors. The raw almonds are a little more delicate, a little buttery, whereas the roasted almonds are a little more complex, have those roasted notes as well that contribute or complement the butteriness and some of the cream and vanilla notes in the toffee. So go ahead and lift this piece up to your nose if you haven't already. And you kind of get those wonderful, just nice nutty notes, maybe a little bit of the butteriness from the almonds coming through as well. Now take a bite. You can hear that snap. And in fact, if you look at the inside, you'll see those butter roasted almonds inside of the toffee, and then you'll see the difference, contrast with those raw almonds on the outside. So two very different colors. But right away, you're gonna get that caramelized sugar, kind of fractures and starts melting in your mouth, but a little bit different than the caramel, which was a little more of a longer melt. This one's gonna melt a little bit faster, actually a lot faster. So because we've cooked out a lot of that additional moisture in the caramel by heating it up, it's gonna melt a lot faster along with those almonds. You should be getting some roasted notes, maybe even like a little bit of like a toasted note, or even like a burnt sugar maybe, or a deeply caramelized sugar. And that's because we heated that sugar up even warmer. And so you get a little like wisp of that burnt, which really I think adds a nice character to the piece. It's not overpowering at all, but it's just kind of there, you know, in a very, very small amount. But the aftertaste is actually fairly short. You get a little bit of that butteriness that kind of remains on your tongue. But it kind of makes you want to go back in for a second piece as well. And go ahead and do that if you'd like. And try a little bit of your wine. This is one of my favorite pairings actually with the wine. That kind of bitter, it's like slight bitterness and creaminess and nuttiness from the almond butter crisp. And the red wine, I think, really work very nicely together. All right, is anybody tasting anything else in this piece? Maybe. Okay. So go ahead and finish that piece there. And if you have any questions, feel free to type it into a little bit of leather. Yeah, so, you know, sometimes when we cook, anytime you're heating ingredients, you know, really past boiling, that caramelization step in the Maillard reaction, you're developing so many different compounds and flavors, aromas, flavor compounds in that process. And a lot of times, you know, you can be developing some of these like earthy, woody notes, sometimes leathery notes, tobacco notes, just like you can, you know, when you taste those in coffee. Like there's no leather or tobacco or wood in coffee, but you'll get those a lot of times because when the beans are roasted at those hotter temperatures, you're kind of developing those similar flavors that can kind of come through that way in the finished drink or chocolate that you're trying. All right, so go ahead and finish that, and we'll jump back, I think, to finish our chocolate making process. So our beans were kind of getting a little bit of a suntan. They were relaxing there a little bit. And so now we want to roast them. We want to take all that delicious flavor that we developed through fermenting and actually translate that into a finished chocolate aroma and chocolate color. And we do that by roasting. But first, we want to make sure that we inspect the beans because we want to ensure that they're properly fermented. We use this little box like you see here. We'll take a sample of those beans and we'll put them in the box, close the box, and we'll slice a blade through it. So it's going to perfectly slice each bean in half. And that'll allow us to get a look at the center. So what we're looking for, the two beans on the left, see that very even distribution of color? The beans on the right are under fermented, and we would actually reject those. You can see they're very different. There's kind of like a very distinct border between the exterior of the bean and the interior. It's a little more maroon and then a little bit of a lighter red color on the inside. So we would reject those because those beans would not give us all of the flavors that we're looking for in our premium chocolate. So we'll let some other chocolate company, buy those beans, but we won't use them for our Ethel beans. A lot of folks ask, at times, depending on the specific type, this can be up to 30% of the beans that are basically, on contract for us that we have reserved. So we don't actually pay for them until they get sorted, and then we bring that order in to be roasted. But at times, that can be up to 30%, kind of depending on the area. Was there a bad harvest? Was there a lot of rain? That can all be contributing factors into the quality of the finished bean. But for roasting, as I mentioned, similar to actually the way that we roast coffee beans to make light, medium, or dark roasted coffee. So we're going to roast these beans kind of depending on the specific variety that we're using. Each bean kind of has its own unique flavor, whether it's a bean, maybe from Brazil, or a bean from Ecuador, a bean from Ghana, Indonesia, Philippines, Dominican Republic. They're all going to be a little bit different. And so the way that we roast them is going to be a little bit different. Just really depending on that specific variety, will depend on how we roast it and really bring out all those wonderful flavors and really show the best quality that bean has to offer. And so once the beans are roasted, we're then going to take the shells off. So here you can see I've got a bowl of some roasted cocoa beans. You can see very different than the white unroasted raw bean that I have here. It still has that pulp on there. But with these beans, once they're roasted, I'm going to pick one up and show you. We want to get the shells off. So you can see as I flip this over, you'll see how it's kind of cracked there. So because there's a little bit of residual moisture in the bean when we roast it, that's going to turn to steam in the roasting process. And as it escapes, it's going to crack the shell. And that's really important because we don't want the shell in our chocolate. It's very bitter and does not contribute anything to our delicious chocolate. So see how easily that I removed it and left the bean intact? Because that extra moisture is in that bean, it really allows us to remove the shell very easily. But this is the nib, or really the purest form of chocolate. And this is what we're going to use to make our finished chocolate recipes. And you can see I'm just pressing it in my hand a little bit. And you see how it, just with a couple fingers, it just kind of breaks up like that. So these beans are actually about 50% fat, and that's what's helping, kind of allowing those beans. You couldn't do that with a coffee bean. If you tried to, yeah, you wouldn't probably be able to break it. Maybe if it was like really, really like super roasted. But because of the fat content of these beans and the light roast that we're typically applying, or light to medium roast, they're going to break up really, really easily in our hands like that. And these nibs are what will be turning into our finished chocolate. So here I've got a bowl of them. They're just the chopped up nibs. And what we're going to do now is we're going to grind them. And so we'll either use a grinder or a ball mill, different ways to kind of grind those and process those nibs. But what we're trying to do is really grind them down. And when we do that, that cocoa butter, that fat is going to release from the nibs. And that's going to start looking or turning into what looks like our finished chocolate. So at this stage, it's about 100%, it's 100% unsweetened chocolate. But we're going to want to add our other ingredients to that, because there are some folks that like 100% unsweetened chocolate, but it's very bitter. It's very strongly flavored. And so, for our recipes, we really want to, create a dark chocolate, which is going to have some sugar added, maybe a little bit of milk powder, a little bit of vanilla. And so we're going to add those ingredients in at this stage. And they're all going to grind down together. Everything's going to come down together. And so it's very uniform in the mouthfeel. And that's going to take several hours. while we kind of grind everything down until we develop our finished chocolate recipe. So it's at this stage that you would basically decide, okay, we're going to make a dark chocolate, or we're going to make milk chocolate, or even a white chocolate. You would vary your ingredients based on the specific recipe you're going to make. And if you're going to do white chocolate, what you would do is actually take this liquor mixture and you would compress it with a lot of force and pressure, so much so that you can actually separate the cocoa solids from the cocoa butter, which is the fat, and those will separate, and you'll be left with, on the cocoa butter side, just that cocoa butter, which is kind of yellow, like whitish yellow in color. And to make white chocolate, we're just going to use the cocoa butter along with some sugar and milk, vanilla, maybe some other flavorants to make that white chocolate. And that is why it's white or kind of yellow in color and not brown like other chocolates. So depending on our recipe, we'll make that finished chocolate. And now at this point, we've got really what's going to taste like chocolate. It's going to be silky smooth in our mouth, but it's not going to act like finished chocolate because it still has to be tempered. I see somebody said a lot of labor. Yeah, it is so intense, the process to make chocolate, all of these steps. And if one thing goes wrong, you've lost everything. And so you've got to make sure that you're maintaining your quality standards and you're paying attention to all of these steps to really bring out the best flavor in your chocolate. But finally, tempering is something we need to do. So we need to heat it and cool it very specifically for a very specific time and temperature to allow for that chocolate to set up in a stable way. If you just let chocolate set up on its own, it will not stabilize. It'll actually form very unstably and form unstable crystals in the chocolate, which will be very crumbly. They'll look kind of like dull or hazy. They'll melt really easily in your hand, but they're not going to give us all of those characteristics that we appreciate with premium chocolate. And so we need to temper it. And that tempering process is going to allow it to set up really glossy and shiny. It's going to snap when we bite into it, and it's going to melt, in our mouth, not in our hand, give us all those wonderful characteristics. And that's, as I said, really just heating and cooling the chocolate. It gets very complex, but very specific temperatures for very specific amounts of time to develop these stable crystals in the cocoa butter. And then you can see in this photo, we are now enrobing. That's one of our satin creams, but our milk chocolate sea salt caramel would have gone through that same process with milk chocolate, kind of gets drenched in chocolate there. And then that chocolate kind of gets filtered back up through and then ready for the next pieces. All right.
Awesome. There's a few questions on this slide. Regarding the sorting process, does every single bean get put into that sorter, or is it only for sampling?
No, so they take a sample of, of a bag, for example. So a bag, I think, can be like couple hundred pounds. And so they'll take, this is a small sampling box just for like the lab. But they have bigger sampling like boxes that they use. And now they can do some inspection with x-rays. I believe, or if it's not x-rays, it's something else, another type of scan that they can do to really get a feel for, okay, what's the moisture content? What's the, how well fermented is it? But that's really the most traditional way.
Cool. And then when you take off the skin, is that all done by hand or do you use a machine?
So there is a machine that's done, and we don't include it here, but it's something called winnowing. It's kind of cool, but really what it does is these beans are going to be pretty light. The shell is very, very light, and then the nib is a little bit heavier. But what happens is those beans, when they're roasted, they get blown through this big channel. It's like think of it like a big metal tube. And what happens is those beans are blown through the tube and they're banging around inside of the tube. And what that does is the beans are already kind of cracked. But what that's going to do is with that air, it's going to kind of blow the skin or the shell off of the nib. And the shell will fly up with the air, but the nib will fall because it's a little bit heavier. And that is how we kind of separate the skin from the nib. And that's called winnowing, Winnowing.
Thank you.
Great, okay, let's jump back to our chocolate. I'm sure you guys are all ready for the next piece. This is our desert honey, Mojave desert honey truffle. So now this is our first dark chocolate piece. We're gonna notice these aromas are gonna be a little bit darker, more of a roasted note. You might even pick up a little bit of coffee or like an espresso. Again, because of that hotter temperature of roast that we're using or longer period, you're developing some of those same roasted notes that you might even taste in coffee. A little bit of vanilla as well. But the first thing too, you'll notice, you'll look the beautiful color. Let's make sure we kind of stop to appreciate that. So again, colored cocoa butter. This is actually two different colors. You got a copper and then a nice little spritz of gold on the outside. Take a bite and kind of hear that snap right when you bit into the piece. Even though the shell is pretty thin, that snap is really important because that's telling us our chocolate is really well tempered. If it wasn't tempered, you would not have that snap at all. But right away, the first thing you'll notice, that honey flavor coming through, the Mojave desert honey. But it's going to melt a little bit faster than some of these other chocolates. So because when we make this piece, we're going to make a chocolate ganache, and that's going to be the center. So typically all truffles are made using a chocolate ganache, and that's just really an emulsion or a blend of cream and chocolate. So we'll heat the cream up to just below boiling, and we're going to pour that over our chocolate, and that's going to kind of start the chocolate melting down together. We're going to blend that with the cream, and so everything gets melted and kind of same temperature together. We blend that up, and then we add our Mojave desert honey, which is actually we get locally here just outside of Las Vegas in the Mojave desert. And primarily that honey is made from fireweed, which is it's pretty strong. If you can think about the plant life that's growing in the desert, you don't have a lot of it, but what you do have that bees can use to make honey is this fireweed, and it's very potent. And so you'll notice in the honey, there's a pretty strong flavor from the honey that's coming through. But that's paired really nicely with the dark chocolate ganache. So that'll start to melt. You'll get some of those roasted cocoa notes, coffee, espresso. And then the dark chocolate shell will start to melt, introduce a little bit more bitterness, but more of that chocolate aroma flavor. Get a little bit of vanilla as well. What about you guys? What are you tasting in this one? Honey, excellent, yes. You might even get a little bit of like a citrus blossom as well, or it's kind of like a hint of orange maybe coming in from that as well. Our dark chocolate, we actually add just a tiny bit of orange oil to our dark chocolate. It's very, very small, but just enough to kind of add just a hint of that citrus blossom flavor that you try. Sometimes you can taste it, other times it's a little bit more difficult, but when you take it out, you definitely notice it when it's not in the finished chocolate. It's one of those things that, like, as I mentioned, it's kind of like in the background, like behind the scenes, doing some work, adding to the complexity of the flavor. Great. Now with this one, perfume, yep, absolutely. That's another one as well with the honey. And with this being a dark chocolate piece, we can also look to pair with like a little bit something with a little more body, a little more something with like a Zinfandel, for example, or late harvest Zinfandel that we have on there. That's those grapes that are used to make that wine. Those are actually left on the vine thus the name late harvest. And in doing that, you get a little bit more of the residual sugar in the grape, which translates into a little bit of a sweeter wine. And traditionally, those are a little higher in alcohol with that sweetness, but really great pairings, especially with chocolate, especially dark chocolate pieces. All right, capture any notes that you'd like on that one. And we will sadly move on to our last piece. Well, last piece for me, but not last piece for you. But our last piece in the tasting tonight is the dark chocolate lemon satin cream heart. Oh, I also noticed somebody asked how we got the sparkles on the last piece. So that is like a colored cocoa butter, and we'll actually put that into an airbrush, and that will actually get sprayed onto the molds. And so with this piece, the first is, you notice the gold color, that's the one that's on top. So we're gonna put that down first. And then after we do that, we're gonna come over the top with the copper. And so you have that kind of layered effect that when it sticks to the chocolate, it'll absorb, it will accept that color once the chocolate solidifies, as long as it's well tempered. If it's not, it won't come off. Hopefully that helped you understand a little bit more about that. It is really cool. It almost looks like pieces of jewelry, almost like little jewels. Anyway, but our lemon satin cream heart, so you'll notice this one is purple in color, again in that heart shape. And this one also exists. We have this in an oval lemon satin cream mold. It's one of our original 16 recipes that we've had since the early 80s. But this is kind of a Valentine's Day themed version in this heart. So if you bring this up to your nose, you might get a little bit of that lemon coming through, but definitely with that dark chocolate, roasted cocoa. Now take a bite of this one, and then again, listen for that snap that's paramount to really well-tempered chocolate. There's a little more liquid, so be careful. Right away, really tart, sour lemon. Kind of coats your tongue. And now, when you have that, kind of press your mouth or press your tongue up against the roof of your mouth. It's going to take a little longer, but that dark chocolate will start to kind of melt. And it's going to slowly just kind of start cutting that lemon flavor. Introduce some bitterness, some roasted cocoa. But it really nicely, it's like at first you have just the lemon, it's like very strong, and then the dark chocolate just kind of comes in. And then they're both kind of just very equal and very well rounded. You kind of get this lemon chocolate experience, but you know, they're really sharing the stage. You're not really having one compete for the attention. They're both just, you know, kind of in balance, which is really important when we're creating chocolate pieces. You know, you want to put the right amount of chocolate on there so that when you taste it with the center, it's well balanced. You don't want to just have, you know, just like you don't want to pair a very alcoholic, very full-bodied wine with like a white chocolate, because it would just overpower it. You know, with ingredients, we want to really balance those ingredients so that it's really nice and well-rounded on your palate. What about you guys? What are you tasting with this one? Let's see here. Tobacco. Yep, you could be getting maybe a little bit in the dark chocolate. Lemon, floral. Yeah, lemon. A lot of lemon. I mean, you've got limonene in lemon, one of the compounds in actual lemons. You know, floral notes, perfumey notes are all kind of coming through there. Yeah, it is, and the sourness does kind of vary a little bit depending on the time of year that we're getting the lemons. These are Eureka lemons or Eureka lemon puree that we're getting in from, I just believe, somewhere right outside of Santa Barbara. But those will actually kind of change a little bit depending on the harvest. So sometimes they're a little more sour, a little bit sweeter. And so I don't think I explained this piece. So to make this one, we start off by making our satin cream center. So we'll take our sugar, cream, and butter, and we're going to heat those up until they're not caramelized, just about 220 to 230 degrees or so. And then we're going to cool all that down, and we'll do that in our cream beater, which is going to not just cool it, but it's actually going to kind of agitate it as well. And that satin cream, as it's cooling, will kind of get blended just very slowly, kind of similar to how, like, if you took not cotton candy, if you took a saltwater taffy puller, you know, the ones that you've seen like on the beach, if you put that inside of like a big bowl, that's kind of what this machine looks like. So it's kind of like pulling and cooling that satin cream center. And eventually that will turn into a solid. And that's when we're going to add our lemon puree to it. And that will kind of turn it back from a solid back into a liquid. And that's going to form the center of this piece. And we'll deposit that into the shell with the chocolate, actually in a process we call the single shot depositing process. It's actually one nozzle that has two different channels in it. So when we deposit into the mold, we can deposit the chocolate on the shell and then the center of the lemon in one shot. It's really cool to see if you ever come out and visit us in Henderson, but it's a really, really neat process, especially with this specific piece. All right. Take us a little sip of your wine if you'd like to as well. And does anybody have any questions? We have a few other pieces as well included. So unfortunately, we don't have the time to go over all of them tonight, but want to give you just a little bit of an idea of what they are. So the first is the dark chocolate prickly pear satin cream. So that's kind of like the lemon, but it's got instead of lemon, it's using prickly pear puree. So prickly pear comes from a cactus, actually. It's a fruit of a cactus. And we take that and we puree it with a little bit of sugar and some acid, and acid, like citric acid. And we blend that. So it's a really nice kind of tangy, almost like a little bit like a bubblegum flavor, actually, with chocolate. The raspberry satin cream, that's one of our signature classic pieces with milk chocolate. And the white chocolate solid heart I spoke to earlier, that one's going to be a little lighter, more a little sweeter, vanilla and creamy notes with that piece.
Awesome. I do want to take a second. If you have any questions, go ahead and type that into the Q&A area so we can keep track of everything. But thank you all so much for joining us. We'd like to offer you all a 15% off discount code on ethelm.com. And that is good for anything on the site. We have another virtual tasting coming up on St. Patrick's Day that we'll be hosting. So if you enjoyed this one, definitely check out the next one. And that code is virtual at checkout, and that's good until the 21st of February. If you have any questions, go ahead and type it in the Q&A and I will ask Mark. I know we got one. How many different mold shapes do we have?
Of course, I took a bite of more chocolate right when you asked that question.
Right when I asked.
So mold shapes, we have probably, I want to say probably close to between 20 and 30 maybe. We don't use all of them every day. Some are for seasonal, holiday, Valentine's Day, Easter. But I would say between there, probably closer to 30 actually.
Wow. And what is our best-selling piece that we have?
Best-selling piece would be the lemon satin cream. So the everyday version of the last piece that we tried, that lemon satin cream heart. Mm-hmm. But also we have, on the alcohol side, we do have a couple other pieces that are newer that are always within our best-selling, few pieces. Those are the dark chocolate cherry cordial and the dark chocolate cognac truffle. So that cognac truffle is kind of like the honey, but instead of honey, we actually add Remy Martin XO Cognac. So that blends with the chocolate, really adds this beautiful warmth. And it's not very biting, like it's really nice, a really nice complement with the dark chocolate. So if you have a chance to try that one, I would highly recommend it.
Awesome. And what areas do we buy most of our cocoa from? I think you might have mentioned it on the map slide, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, so I don't think I mentioned it. I think I did on the tasting yesterday, but I would say, so we use a blend of beans again. So every bean is a little bit different, you know, kind of like how a Cabernet Sauvignon grape grown in California is different than one grown in, you know, France. The same with cocoa. So there are three main types of cocoa, Criollo, Trinitario, and Forastero. And different countries all have different, you know, nuances and flavors. So we're going to look for a blend of beans to really give us like all of the different characteristics that we want in our chocolate. And those are from Ecuador, the Ivory Coast, and also Brazil. But that will kind of vary, you know, if like Brazil or Ecuador, if one of them has like a really bad harvest, we're going to have to, you know, supplement those beans from somewhere else. And so, you know, we're always kind of mixing and blending different beans to really give us like the best combination of flavors that are specific to our FLM chocolates. And that's something too, you know, it's one of the great things about being a part of Mars, in that, you know, we're really controlling every step of the process. Many other small chocolate companies are actually buying their chocolate from a commercial company, and they're basically just, you know, making their own pieces, but we're actually buying the beans, we're blending, we're roasting the beans, we're creating that chocolate from our own supply chain. And, you know, we're controlling every step of the way. So we can make sure that we're maintaining the quality and specific elements of each of those beans and flavors in the finished chocolate. So something I'm really proud to be able to talk about.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, because I know we're a little bit past 6 o'clock. How much cocoa is needed for one piece that we make, or like the box they ate tonight? So, like, how many beans do you think went into that?
I would say, I need to do some math here. Hold on.
I know we're just doing this.
Like, I would say probably probably 6 or 7 beans. Probably closer to, see, it kind of depends, because like, you know, the pieces we tried tonight, they're not 100% chocolate. And so we have a ratio of the chocolate to the center. And so it's a little bit different with each piece. So I would say, like, you know, basically rounding, I mean, there's about 400 beans to every pound of solid chocolate. And then if you're kind of breaking that down, yeah, I would say probably about 6 to 7 beans.
Cool. Someone else asked about if we could send out these slides. We will have these slides on our YouTube. If you go to youtube.com and type FLM Chocolates, you can find this presentation tomorrow morning, as well as every other past tasting that Mark or Tammy Jo has done. If you've done it and want to reference that, you can find those all on our YouTube. But thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We had fun. Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day.